The smoke hit her lungs before she even opened her eyes. Mabel Winslow bolted upright from her cot, her hand already reaching for the Morse key out of sheer instinct. But the moment her fingers found empty air, she remembered the key was gone, the apparatus was gone, and the building that housed the entire Rattlesnake Creek Telegraph office was burning down around her in sheets of roaring, merciless orange. She had maybe 30 seconds before the roof came down. She grabbed her leather satchel from beneath the cot, the one thing she never slept without, the one thing that mattered more than anything else on this burning, faithless earth, and she ran. She hit the door with her shoulder, felt the wood give, and stumbled out into the midnight air of the Wyoming territory, coughing smoke from her chest, her dark hair unbound and wild around her face. Behind her, the telegraph office collapsed with a sound like thunder swallowed by hell. She stood in the dust and watched it burn, and she already knew with the cold, clear certainty that her mind always delivered in moments of crisis. This was not an accident. The fire had started too fast, too hot, too deliberately at the base of the equipment wall where the battery jars sat. Someone had wanted the telegraph destroyed. Someone had wanted the message she had received 2 hours ago, the message she had decoded in her Cipher notebook and had not yet sent on to die in those flames. But the message had not died. It lived in her head, in the elegant labyrinth of her memory, in the rows and columns of substitution cipher that she could hold in her mind the way a pianist holds a sonata. And the message, the terrible, urgent, damning message, told her one thing with absolute clarity. Calvin Dalton's ranch was going to be stolen from him by morning. She had one horse. She had 22 miles of dark Wyoming prairie between her and the Dalton spread. She had enemies behind her who had just burned down a federal telegraph office, a hanging offense, which meant they were desperate enough to do anything to keep this secret buried. Mabel Winslow swung up onto her gray mare, pressed her knees in hard, and rode. She had never met Calvin Dalton. She knew his name only from the wire traffic that passed through Rattlesnake Creek Station, cattle counts, land disputes, supply orders, the ordinary commerce of a man building something real in unforgiving country. But she knew enough. She knew he had fought for every acre. She knew someone wanted those acres badly enough to commit arson and forgery and fraud to take them. And she knew, with the part of her that had always been drawn toward justice like iron filings toward a magnet, that she was not going to let that happen. The mare's hooves ate the dark ground. The stars above the Wyoming territory blazed like spilled salt on black velvet, indifferent and magnificent. Mabel leaned low and rode with everything she had, and the burning building behind her shrank to a dull red ember in the darkness, and then disappeared entirely. She did not look back. She had learned, in 26 years of living on the sharp edge of a world that did not always welcome women who thought too precisely and moved too independently, that looking back was a luxury she could not afford. What she could not have known, racing through that wild dark toward a man she had never spoken to, was that the next 48 hours would dismantle every careful wall she had built around her heart, and that the Cipher woman and the rancher would find in each other something neither had ever allowed themselves to want. But first, the fire, and the message, and the terrible trap that had been laid. Let us go back to where it truly began. 3 weeks earlier, Mabel Winslow had arrived in Rattlesnake Creek, Wyoming territory, in the autumn of 1882, aboard the Cheyenne to Sheridan mail coach, with a commission from the Western Union Telegraph Company, a leather satchel full of Cipher notebooks, and precisely no tolerance for the particular brand of skepticism that frontier men directed at frontier women who held positions of technical expertise. She was the new telegraph operator, assigned to replace old Silas Potts, who had retired after 20 years of service with failing eyesight and a persistent cough. She had worked the wire in Denver, in Laramie, and briefly in Kansas City, and she was, by any honest accounting, one of the finest Morse operators west of the Mississippi. Her speed was legendary among the company men, 32 words per minute on the key, and she could decode a corrupted or scrambled transmission with the kind of fluid ease that made other operators lean in and stare with something between admiration and unease. The cipher work was unofficial. It was her own system, developed over years of working with garbled transmissions and coded messages from railroad agents and government surveyors who did not trust their communications to plain text. She had built a substitution cipher sophisticated enough that a message intercepted mid-transmission would read as pure nonsense to anyone without her key, but would resolve into clean, readable prose the moment she applied her columns and rows of letter transpositions. Western Union did not pay her for the cipher work. She did it because it was beautiful, and because it was hers, and because, in a world that constantly tried to diminish what she was capable of, being undeniably and provably the best at something was a kind of armor. Rattlesnake Creek was a small town by Wyoming standards, a main street of perhaps 12 buildings, a livery stable, a general store run by a broad woman named Mrs. Hutchins who seemed to know everything about everyone, a saloon called the Broken Bridle that was never as rowdy as its name suggested, a land office, a small church, and the telegraph station, which sat at the eastern end of Main Street in a narrow building that smelled of battery acid and old wood. Mabel had settled in quickly, as she always did. She had a practical talent for making a space her own. She lined her cipher notebooks on the shelf above the Morse apparatus. She tacked a map of Wyoming territory to the wall with the telegraph line routes marked in red ink. She kept her cot neat and her lamp trimmed, and she learned the names of the ranchers and farmers and merchants whose wire traffic made up the daily commerce of the station. It was through that wire traffic that she first came to know the outline of Calvin Dalton. He was, according to the messages that passed through her key, 32 years old, the owner of the Dalton Ranch situated roughly 22 miles northeast of Rattlesnake Creek along the Powder River. He ran a cattle operation of moderate size, around 400 head, and he leased additional grazing land under the terms of an old territorial agreement that predated Wyoming's formal organization. His messages were terse and functional: orders for fencing wire, inquiries about cattle prices, a brief and dignified communication with a Denver bank about a loan he had paid off 2 years ahead of schedule. She liked the loan repayment. It told her something about him. Men who paid their debts 2 years early were men who meant what they said. She had not thought much beyond that. He was a name on a ledger of wire traffic, a rancher among dozens, a man she had no particular reason to think about. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of October, a message came through that made her sit very still at her key and read it twice, and then a third time, and then reach for her cipher notebook with hands that were entirely steady because Mabel Winslow did not allow her hands to shake. The message had originated in Cheyenne, from a law office. On the surface, it appeared to be a routine communication about a land deed transfer, the kind of dry legal language that passed through telegraph offices daily without arousing any particular interest. But the message was slightly scrambled, in the particular way that sometimes happened when transmission quality was poor, and when Mabel ran it through her standard error correction process, she realized that the scrambling was not accidental. Someone had deliberately embedded a second message inside the legal boilerplate, using a simple but clever substitution code that rode beneath the surface text like a current beneath still water. Mabel Winslow broke that code in 11 minutes. What it said, stripped of its disguise and rendered into plain language, was this: the land deed transfer being processed at the Rattlesnake Creek land office was fraudulent. The original deed to the northeast quadrant of the Powder River grazing territory, the land Calvin Dalton had been leasing legally for 7 years, had been altered. A man named Harlan Voss, who operated a competing cattle operation out of Buffalo, Wyoming, had paid a Cheyenne lawyer named Whitmore to produce a backdated deed showing that Voss, not Dalton, held the original claim to that land. The fraudulent deed was scheduled to be filed at the Rattlesnake Creek Land Office at 9 o'clock on the morning of October the 19th. The message was a warning from someone inside Whitmore's office, a clerk Mabel suspected, with a conscience sharper than his employer's, who had taken a risk to expose the fraud before it became irreversible fact. The warning had been sent to Mabel's station, specifically because the sender knew the message would need to be decoded, and apparently trusted that whoever operated the Rattlesnake Creek station would have the capability to do it. She wondered, briefly and with a flicker of professional pride, if her reputation had traveled that far. October the 19th was 3 weeks away. Plenty of time to alert the proper authorities, to contact Calvin Dalton directly, to ensure that the fraud was exposed before it succeeded. Mabel had drafted a clear wire to the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne and encoded the relevant details in her own, considerably more sophisticated cipher, the kind that would take a professional cryptographer several days to crack, rather than 11 minutes. She had sent that wire. She had logged the decoded message in her cipher notebook. She had felt the satisfying click of a crisis properly handled. What she had not accounted for was Harlan Voss. Specifically, she had not accounted for the fact that Harlan Voss employed a man named Clement Greer, who worked the saloon at Rattlesnake Creek 3 nights a week, and who had been in the habit of reading the outgoing message log on the station wall whenever old Silas Potts left it unattended, which the old man had done with the cheerful carelessness of someone who had never imagined that his sleepy little station mattered to anyone with dangerous intentions. Mabel had changed that habit immediately upon her arrival. The log was kept inside now and locked, but by the time she arrived, the damage to her safety was already done. Clement Greer had seen enough outgoing traffic in Silas's final weeks to know that the Rattlesnake Creek station was intercepting and decoding communications that someone very badly wanted to keep private. And when the new operator began locking the log and demonstrating, through the simple act of keeping everything locked and orderly, that she was sharper than her predecessor, Greer had reported back to Harlan Voss. Voss had decided that the Telegraph office needed to burn. He had given Greer until October the 19th, the date of the filing, to ensure that any warnings sent from Rattlesnake Creek were neutralized. Greer had spent 2 weeks watching and planning, and on the night of October the 18th, the night before the fraudulent deed was to be filed, he had crept up to the station after midnight and set the battery wall alight with a tin of lamp oil. What Greer had not accounted for was that Mabel Winslow slept at the station. What Voss had not accounted for was that Mabel Winslow, even awakened from sleep by smoke and fire, with everything burning around her, was not a woman who needed a telegraph machine to remember what a message said. She had read that decoded warning 100 times over the past 3 weeks as she worked out the full scope of the fraud, traced the connections between Voss and the Cheyenne lawyer, documented everything in her cipher notebook. She knew every word of it by heart, and she rode through the Wyoming night with all of it burning in her mind as surely as the station burned at her back. The first hour of the ride was hard going. The terrain between Rattlesnake Creek and the Powder River country was rolling grassland broken by dry creek beds and stands of cottonwood, and in the dark, with only the stars and a thin quarter moon for light, the gray mare picked her way with the careful intelligence of a horse who had traveled this country before. Mabel let the mare set the pace she was confident with, resisting the urge to push harder than was safe. A broken leg on this ground would end everything, would end Calvin Dalton's ranch along with it. She used the ride to organize her thoughts. The fraudulent deed filing would happen at 9 in the morning. It was now, she estimated by the moon's position, somewhere close to 1 o'clock. She had 8 hours. That was enough time, provided she could find the Dalton ranch and rouse Calvin Dalton from sleep and convince him, in the space of whatever small hours remained before dawn, that she was telling the truth, and that he needed to ride for town immediately with whatever original documentation he had to counter the filing. The challenge was the convincing part. She was aware of how this looked. A woman alone, arriving at a remote ranch in the dead of night, carrying a story about a telegraph fire and forged land deeds and fraudulent filings. It was, she acknowledged privately, exactly the kind of story that a desperate person might invent. A con artist, a distraction. Even, she supposed with grim humor, an instrument of the very plot she was trying to expose, sent to create confusion and waste time. She would need to be very persuasive. She had the Cipher notebook. She had the decoded message, written in her own hand, with all the supporting analysis she had compiled over the past 3 weeks. She had names, dates, amounts, and the specific legal language of the fraudulent deed, as she had reconstructed it from the encoded warning. Whether a rancher awakened at 2 in the morning would have the patience to examine a Cipher notebook was an open question, but it was all she had, and it would have to be enough. The second hour of the ride brought her into rougher country, the land beginning to rise toward the ridgelines above the Powder River watershed, the grass giving way to patches of sage and low rock. She could smell the river before she could see it. That particular clean, cold scent of moving water, that was one of the things she had come to love about Wyoming, one of the few unambiguous gifts the territory offered. She had been in love with the West since she was a girl in Ohio, reading dispatches from frontier correspondents with the focused hunger of someone who knew, with bone-deep certainty, that she belonged somewhere larger than the world she had been given. Her father had been a printer, a man who loved words and had the great generosity to pass that love to his daughter without reservation, teaching her to set type at 7 and to read telegraph code at 9 from a manual he had found in a Cincinnati bookshop. By 12, she had been faster on the practice key than any of the older students at the telegraphy school, where she had persuaded him to let her attend. She had come west at 21 with a Western Union commission, and a conviction that her talent would open doors that her gender might otherwise keep closed. It had been more complicated than that. It was always more complicated than that, but she had been right in the essential thing. Talent, demonstrated consistently and undeniably, did eventually command respect, even in places where respect was hard-won and harder kept. She had learned to be patient with the skepticism and quicker than the doubt. The Dalton Ranch came into view at what she judged to be close to 2:30 in the morning, announced first by the dark geometric shapes of fence posts along the ridge above the river, then by the square bulk of a large barn against the sky, and finally by the low yellow light of a lamp burning in the window of the ranch house. Mabel slowed the mare to a walk as she came down the slope toward the house, and she kept her hands visible. In the Wyoming Territory in 1882, a rider arriving at a remote ranch in the dead of night was as likely to be met with a rifle as with a greeting, and she had no desire to be shot by the man she had ridden 22 miles to save. She stopped the mare 20 feet from the front porch and called out clearly and without hesitation, the voice of someone with business to conduct, not a voice that apologized for itself. "Hello, the house. My name is Mabel Winslow. I'm the telegraph operator from Rattlesnake Creek, and I have urgent business for Calvin Dalton. I am alone and I am not armed." Silence. The lamp in the window shifted. Then the front door opened, and Calvin Dalton came out onto the porch with a Winchester rifle held across his body, not aimed but ready, and he looked at her with dark eyes that caught the lamplight from the window behind him and gave nothing away. He was taller than she had somehow imagined, a large man with the kind of build that came from real physical work rather than any vanity about it, wide through the shoulders and chest, with dark hair that was slightly too long and a jaw that wore several days of stubble. He was dressed in trousers and a pulled-on shirt that was not fully buttoned, which told her she had woken him, and he was barefoot on the cold porch boards, which told her he had moved fast without stopping to be entirely prepared, which told her something about the kind of man he was. He looked at her for a long, measuring moment. "You're the telegraph operator," he said. It was not quite a question. There was a rough-edged quality to his voice, the kind of voice that was used to open space in fewer words. I am. My office burned down approximately 2 hours ago. The fire was deliberately set by a man named Clement Greer, who works for Harlan Voss. Does that name mean something to you? The rifle shifted fractionally. His jaw tightened. Get down off that horse, he said. Come inside. It was not warm or welcoming, but it was practical, and practical was what she needed. She dismounted with efficient grace and tied the mare at the porch rail, and she followed Calvin Dalton inside. The interior of the ranch house was spare but solid, the kind of interior that said a man had thought about function before comfort and then added comfort where he had time. There was a good stone fireplace with banked coals that still threw warmth, a table with 2 chairs, a cast iron cookstove along the far wall, shelves of supplies, and in the corner, a roll-top desk that was open and disordered with papers in the way of a man who worked more than he filed. A second lamp on the table showed her a room that was clean in the essentials and careless in the details, dishes washed and stacked, but a pair of work boots left just inside the door, a rope half coiled on the floor near the fireplace. He set the rifle against the wall beside the door, which she noted. Not within instant reach, but not far. Fair enough. He looked at her across the table with those dark eyes and the expression that gave nothing away, and she was aware in the back of her mind that he was the kind of physically imposing that women in her position were supposed to find intimidating. She did not find it intimidating. She found it interesting. Tell me, he said, so she told him. She told him about the encoded warning that had come through her station 3 weeks ago, about breaking the cipher, about the fraudulent deed that was scheduled to be filed in the Rattlesnake Creek land office at 9 o'clock that morning. She told him about Harlan Voss and the Cheyenne lawyer named Whitmore, about the backdated deed and the 7 years of legal grazing rights that were about to be buried under a stack of forged paperwork. She told him about the fire, about waking up to smoke, about grabbing her satchel and running. She laid the cipher notebook on the table as she spoke and opened it to the relevant pages. The original encoded message in its scrambled form, the decoded plain text, her 3 weeks of analysis and documentation, everything organized with the precise clarity that was her natural mode of thought. He listened without interrupting. She respected that. Men who could listen were not as common as they should have been. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that felt long. Then he reached across the table and pulled the cipher notebook toward him and looked at it. He turned a page, then another. His eyes moved across the coded columns and the decoded text with an expression that was trying to be skeptical and was gradually losing that battle. You decoded this yourself, he said. It was the same not-quite-question voice. I did, in 11 minutes. It is a fairly simple substitution cipher, the kind a careful amateur would use. I work with considerably more complex systems in my own practice. He looked up at her then, and there was something in his expression that was different from the careful blankness he had been maintaining, something shifting, not doubt exactly, but a recalibration. You rode 22 miles in the dark, he said slowly, after your building burned down to bring me this. I did. Why? The question was not suspicious, she realized. It was genuine. It was the question of a man who was not accustomed to having strangers go out of their way for him. Because it was the right thing to do, she said, with the simplicity of someone who had never found a better answer to that question. And because whoever burned that building did it to stop this information from reaching you, which means they were afraid of exactly this conversation. That made me considerably more determined to have it. Something moved across his face, something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. He looked back at the notebook, then back at her. I have the original deed, he said. The real one with the territorial surveyor's seal and the date. I have every payment record for the lease going back 7 years. Then we need to be in Rattlesnake Creek before 9 o'clock, she said. You need to bring all of it. The land office can't file a deed that conflicts with a properly documented prior claim, not without triggering a legal review, and a legal review, with the documentation I have in this notebook combined with your original deed, will expose Voss and his lawyer as fraudsters." He looked at her for another moment of that measuring silence. Then he stood up from the table. He was very tall when he stood, she noted, the kind of tall that filled the room differently, and he moved to the roll-top desk. "Give me 10 minutes," he said. She sat at the table and listened to him pull papers from the desk, to the sounds of the house around her, the creak of boards, the settling of the fire, the distant low sound of cattle beyond the walls. She was aware of being very tired. The adrenaline of the fire and the ride was beginning to ebb, and beneath it was the bone-tiredness of a woman who had been working at high intensity for 3 weeks without adequate sleep. She did not let herself show the tiredness. She straightened her back and turned to a fresh page in her Cipher notebook, and began writing down everything she remembered about the fire, the exact sequence, the smell, the point of origin, because evidence of arson would be as important to the case against Voss as the forged deed, and she did not want to lose a single detail. When Calvin Dalton came back to the table 9 minutes later, he was carrying a flat leather document case, and he had added a vest and his boots. He set the case on the table and opened it, and inside she saw a sheaf of papers with the organized carefulness of a man who, despite the disorder of his desk, knew which documents mattered and where they lived. He pulled the original deed and set it on the table beside her Cipher notebook. She looked at it, the territorial surveyor's seal embossed in the lower left corner, the date clear and unambiguous, the language of the lease agreement written in the plain-spoken legal style of the late 1870s. Everything about it was genuine in a way that she could recognize at a glance, the way her mind was built to recognize genuine things. "This will hold," she said. "I know it will hold," he said, and the steadiness in his voice was not arrogance. It was the voice of a man who knew what he had built and what it was worth. "I just need to get it in front of the right people before Voss gets his forgery on the record." "Then let's ride," she said, and stood up. He looked at her with that recalibrating expression again, the one she was beginning to associate with moments where she did something he had not expected, though she could not imagine why her being practical and decisive would surprise a man of evident practical decisiveness himself. He went to saddle his horse. She checked on the mare, found water for her at the trough near the barn, and gave her 10 minutes to drink and rest, while Calvin Dalton emerged from the barn leading a big bay gelding that moved with the smooth, collected energy of a horse that was frequently worked and well kept. They rode out of the Dalton ranch yard at a little after 3 in the morning, the Wyoming sky enormous above them and blazing with stars, the cold air carrying the clean scent of sage and river and the first distant suggestion of coming winter. Side by side on the dark trail, they were quiet for a while, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. It was Mabel who broke it first. "You said Harlan Voss's name meant something to you," she said. "Earlier on the porch, your jaw did something." He glanced at her in the darkness, and even in the thin moonlight she caught the edge of what might have been wry amusement. "My jaw did something," he repeated. "It tightened. You recognized the name with more than ordinary recognition. I'd like to understand the history if there is one, because the more context I have the better I can help you." There was a pause. Then he said, "Voss and my father had a dispute over water rights 15 years ago. My father was still alive then. Voss wanted access to the Powder River through the northeast corner of the old Dalton homestead, and my father refused to grant it. The dispute went to the territorial court. My father won. And Voss nursed a grudge for 15 years, she said, apparently. And your father died 6 years ago, left me the ranch and the debt on it." A pause. "I paid off the debt." "I know," she said, "the wire traffic." He looked at her again, and this time the expression was less guarded. "You read my wire traffic." "I read everyone's wire traffic," she said evenly. "It is my job. I notice patterns. I notice character, as much as character can be inferred from commercial communications. And I noticed yours because men who pay their debts early and file their lease renewals on time are patterns that stand out." There was a long silence. Then, That's a strange way to know a person. It is, she agreed. And yet here we are. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one, and something in the air between them shifted slightly, became something warmer than the professional urgency that had dominated the past hour. They rode through the remaining dark hours with conversation that moved between the practical, reviewing the documentation, discussing exactly what they would say to the land office clerk, considering who at the Rattlesnake Creek Marshal's station could be trusted to take the arson report seriously, and the personal, in the tentative way of two people who are discovering with some surprise that they want to know more about the person beside them. She told him about Ohio, about her father and the print shop, about the telegraphy school and the Western Union Commission, and the string of postings that had brought her to Wyoming. She told him these things not with the self-consciousness of someone recounting a resume, but with the directness of someone who found her own story interesting because it was, objectively, interesting. He told her about growing up on the ranch, about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and his father, who had been a hard man in the good sense, demanding, principled, not given to sentiment but honest to the bone. About learning to work cattle in the high country and learning to read the weather and learning to love the particular loneliness of the Wyoming highlands in a way that was not loneliness at all, but something closer to freedom. You love it here, she said, not as an observation but as a recognition. I do, he said, simply the way he said most things. I understand that, she said. I have not been here long enough to love it the way you do, but I understand the feeling. I felt it first in Laramie looking at the Medicine Bow Range, like something finally fitting. Like coming home to a place you've never been, he said. She looked at him. Yes, exactly that. Their eyes met briefly in the dark, and then they both looked forward at the trail, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence had a different quality than before. Dawn came over the Wyoming prairie with the spectacular immodesty of a country that had never learned restraint. A long violet smear on the eastern horizon that thickened to rose, and then to a burning gold that turned the grassland to fire, and the river in the distance to hammered copper. Mabel watched it come up with the particular appreciation of someone who had spent a long, hard night riding toward it. They were perhaps 5 miles from Rattlesnake Creek when Calvin said, without particular emphasis, I want you to know that I believe you, not just the documents. I believed you on the porch before I saw the notebook. She considered that. Why? Because a person with a hidden motive doesn't ride 22 miles alone in the dark, he said. A person with a hidden motive sends someone else, or arrives with a story that's too polished. You showed up covered in smoke and ash with a notebook full of cipher work and you told me the truth without dressing it up. That's not how deception works. You have some experience with deception, she said. Enough. A pause. My father trusted a man once who had the very same quality of plain speaking. Turned out the plain speaking was itself a performance. Cost my father a season's worth of cattle and nearly cost him the ranch. And yet you believed me anyway. Your cipher notebook is real, he said. The work in it is real. A person who spends that kind of time on that kind of work, that's not theater. That's a mind that operates a certain way. She was quiet for a moment because what he had just said was one of the most accurate descriptions of herself she had ever heard from someone who had known her for less than 3 hours, and she was not entirely sure what to do with that. That is a perceptive observation for 2 in the morning, she said finally. It's 5 in the morning now, he said, with the not quite laugh in his voice again. I'm more perceptive at 5. They rode into Rattlesnake Creek at 6:15, past the still-smoking ruins of the telegraph station that sat at the eastern end of Main Street like a dark wound. Calvin Dalton slowed his horse as they passed it, and looked at the wreckage with an expression that was partly the practical assessment of a man looking at a burned building and partly something she could not quite name, a kind of anger held very still, the way deep water holds its stillness over a current. Clement Greer, he said. Most likely. I did not see who set the fire, but the evidence points clearly enough. She looked at the ruins with a steadiness she had to work slightly harder for than usual. My notebooks were inside, most of them, the work of the past several months. She had said it in the same even tone she used for everything, but he heard something in it. She could tell by the way he turned to look at her, and she was briefly and unexpectedly moved by the fact that he had noticed. "I'm sorry," he said, not inflated with sentiment, just direct the way he said everything. "The important one I had with me," she said. "I always sleep with the current work notebook. The rest were reference replaceable over time." She straightened in the saddle. "We have work to do." They went first to the marshal's office, where a young deputy named Ford was beginning his morning shift, and received their story with the careful skepticism of someone who was 23 and did not want to make a mistake in either direction. Mabel laid out the arson evidence, her written notes from the ride, the evidence of the fire's point of origin, and Calvin added the land fraud documentation. And between them, they presented a case that was so methodically organized and internally consistent that young Ford reached for his message pad within 15 minutes and began writing a wire to the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne. The land office opened at 8. They were there at 5 minutes past with Calvin's original deed and Mabel's 3 weeks of decoded intelligence and analysis. And the clerk, an older man named Peters who had been filing deeds in Rattlesnake Creek for 9 years and had the careful professional pride of someone who took his record-keeping very seriously, looked at Harlan Voss's fraudulent document, which had already been delivered by courier in a sealed envelope, and then looked at Calvin's original deed, and then looked at Mabel's Cipher notebook with the decoded warning in it, and his expression went through several interesting transitions. He did not file Voss's deed. He held it and said he would need to await guidance from the territorial surveyor's office before proceeding with any filing on the disputed territory, which was precisely the correct professional response, and which meant that the fraud was effectively stopped in the moment that mattered most. Harlan Voss arrived at 8:50, accompanied by a sharp-faced man in a town suit who turned out to be the Cheyenne lawyer Whitmore, and found Calvin Dalton and Mabel Winslow already present, with the deputy marshal standing in the corner, and the look on Voss's face when he realized that his very carefully constructed trap had failed was something that Mabel filed away in her memory with the satisfaction of a precisely completed cipher. Voss was a thick-set man in his 50s with small, pale eyes and the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now just calculating. He looked at Calvin with the particular hatred of someone who has lost something they considered already won. "Dalton," he said. "Voss," Calvin said. Then Voss looked at Mabel and the calculation in his pale eyes sharpened. "The Telegraph woman. The one whose building you burned," she said pleasantly. He started to say something, then saw the deputy marshal step forward slightly, and whatever he had been about to say did not get said. The next 3 hours were the most complex of the bureaucratic kind, the deputy sending wires, waiting for responses, the clerk keeping the fraudulent deed in his locked drawer, while the territorial machinery began to turn, Whitmore the lawyer making increasingly confident statements about his client's documentation that became increasingly less confident as Mabel, sitting at the clerk's spare desk with her cipher notebook open, calmly and methodically explained to Peters, to the deputy, and eventually to Whitmore himself, exactly how the forgery had been constructed, what the cipher in the embedded message had said, and why the original warning, sent from inside Whitmore's own office by a clerk with more conscience than his employer, was documented evidence of prior knowledge of fraud. It was the moment that Calvin Dalton would remember for the rest of his life. He was standing to one side, watching, and he saw Whitmore, a lawyer with 20 years of practice, a man who made his living with words and arguments, begin to go pale as Mabel Winslow, calm as running water, demolished his position with the systematic precision of someone disassembling a clock. She spoke without notes, drawing entirely from memory, and the case she built was airtight and elegant and completely devastating, and she built it in the same tone she might use to explain the weather. Calvin Dalton, who had been doing hard, necessary, physical work his entire life, who had faced down cattle drives and blizzards and drought and 15 years of Harlan Voss's simmering hostility, felt something happen inside his chest that he could not immediately name. He had known she was capable. He had believed that the Cipher notebook was real, that the work in it was real, that the mind behind it was extraordinary. But watching her in operation, watching the way her intelligence functioned not as an abstraction, but as a living, breathing, razor-sharp instrument pointed directly at the injustice in front of her, he was, for the first time in memory, simply and completely astonished. He had met capable people. He had even admired capable people. But he had never felt, watching someone exercise their capability, this particular mixture of awe and something much warmer that was beginning to press against the walls of the careful, self-contained life he had built. It frightened him slightly. He was not a man who frightened easily. By 11 o'clock, the territorial marshal's response had arrived by wire routed through the Buffalo station, since Rattlesnake Creek's office was ash, confirming that a warrant had been issued for Harlan Voss, and that Whitmore's law license was under immediate review. 2 federal marshals were riding from Cheyenne and would arrive by evening. Clement Greer was found at his rooming house on the west end of town at noon, still sleeping, with a tin of lamp oil under his cot that matched the evidence Mabel had documented in her notes. He was arrested by Deputy Ford with considerably more confidence than the deputy had shown at 6 in the morning. Harlan Voss was arrested before he could leave town. He did not go quietly, but he went. Mabel Winslow sat in the land office after it was over and wrote a complete, detailed account of everything. The encoded warning, the decipherment, the fire, the ride, the documentation, in the careful, precise language of an official report, which she addressed to Western Union's regional director, the territorial marshal, and the clerk of the territorial court. She wrote it in 2 hours without stopping, and when she put down the pen her hand was trembling slightly, and she looked at it with some surprise, because she had not realized until this moment how much tension she had been holding. Calvin Dalton was sitting across the table from her. He had been there for most of the previous 2 hours, occasionally leaving to speak to the deputy or to see to their horses or to fetch coffee from the hotel dining room across the street, and he was there now with 2 cups and a plate of something hot from the hotel kitchen, and he set them on the table in front of her with a matter-of-fact practicality that was, she found, considerably more moving than any flourish would have been. "Eat something," he said. She looked at the food and realized she was ravenous. She ate without self-consciousness, which seemed to please him in some way she could not quite parse. "What will you do?" he asked after a while. "About the station?" "Rebuild, I imagine. Western Union will send equipment. I'll need temporary quarters until the station is reconstructed." She paused. "Mrs. Hutchins at the general store mentioned she lets rooms." "She does." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "For what it's worth, there's a room at the ranch. It's nothing remarkable, a spare bedroom, its own window, and I won't be in your way. It would be more comfortable than town while you wait for the station to be rebuilt." Mabel looked at him. He met her gaze with the same direct steadiness he brought to everything, and she saw no hidden motive in it, no secondary agenda, only the practical generosity of someone who had decided he owed her something, and was trying to pay it in the only currency he had available. She thought about the Cipher notebooks that had burned. She thought about 22 miles of dark prairie and a man who had listened and acted and stood to one side in the land office while she did the work she was built to do, and had never once suggested she should step back or speak more softly or let him handle it. "That's a generous offer," she said carefully. "It's a practical one," he said, which was exactly the right thing to say. "Then I accept," she said. "Practically." Something moved in his expression, that not quite smile again. The next several weeks unfolded with the particular quality of time that exists between crisis and resolution, a kind of clearing period like air after rain. The federal marshals arrived that evening and took custody of Voss and Whitmore. Clement Greer faced arson charges. The territorial court in Cheyenne opened a formal inquiry into the land fraud, and Calvin's original deed was certified as valid by the territorial surveyor, who made the trip from Cheyenne himself, a careful old man named Aldrich who examined the document with a jeweler's loupe and declared it unimpeachable. Calvin's grazing rights on the Northeast Powder River Territory were formally confirmed. The land that his father had worked and that he had worked after him, the land that Harlan Voss had spent 15 years scheming to take, was his, and Mabel Winslow was living in the spare bedroom at the Dalton Ranch. This arrangement was, objectively, entirely sensible. The town was a 30-minute ride. Western Union had confirmed the rebuild but could not begin work for at least 3 weeks, given the need to transport equipment and materials from Cheyenne. Mrs. Hutchins did let rooms, but her establishment was cramped and noisy, shared with 2 other lodgers, and offered no space for the cipher work that Mabel needed to resume. The ranch had a good table, a quiet room, and a landowner who woke early and worked hard and left her entirely alone when she needed to be left alone. It was the last quality that she valued most. She had lived enough of her life in arrangements where being alone was treated as something to be corrected, where her solitude and her focus and her deep preference for the company of a complicated problem over the company of most people had been viewed as deficiencies to be gently remedied. Calvin Dalton, who seemed to have a similar relationship with solitude, never tried to remedy anything about her. What he did instead was considerably more dangerous. He was simply, consistently himself around her. He did not perform. He did not try to impress her. He got up at 5 in the morning and worked until dark and came in for supper smelling of horse and cold air and honest labor, and he sat across the table from her and talked, when they talked, about real things: the condition of the land, the behavior of the cattle herd, the politics of the Wyoming territorial government, a book he was making his way through slowly in the evenings by lamplight, a history of the Lewis and Clark expedition that he had found in Laramie years ago and returned to periodically, and he listened. When she talked about the cipher work she was rebuilding, about the mathematics of code construction, about the political situation in Washington that affected the Telegraph network, about her father's print shop, and the way setting type had taught her to think about language as a physical object that could be rearranged, he listened with the complete, unhurried attention of someone for whom the person speaking was genuinely the most interesting thing in the room. She was not accustomed to being listened to. She was accustomed to being tolerated with varying degrees of patience. The distinction was, she was discovering enormous. She was also discovering, with the somewhat alarmed precision of a woman who had always applied her analytical mind to her own internal states as readily as to external problems, that she was in considerable danger of falling in love with Calvin Dalton. She examined this realization with the same systematic care she applied to everything. The evidence was clear. She thought about him when they were not together. She found herself inventing small reasons to be in the same room, asking about the ranch's water rights not because she needed to know, but because it led to a conversation. She had noticed, with embarrassing specificity, the exact color of his eyes in different lights, and the way his voice dropped slightly when he was saying something he meant with particular depth, and the fact that he had calluses on his right hand in precisely the locations that indicated regular rope work, and that she found this, inexplicably, extremely appealing. The evidence pointed in one direction. She resisted the conclusion not because the logic failed, but because the stakes were high. She was temporary here. She was a telegraph operator awaiting a rebuilt station. In 3 weeks or 4 or 6, she would move back to town and resume her professional life, and Calvin Dalton's spare bedroom would return to being an empty room. She had a career that took her where the company sent her. She had spent 5 years building a professional reputation in a field that did not easily make room for women, And every time she had allowed anything personal to complicate that career, the complication had cost her more than the personal had been worth. She told herself these things. She believed them. They were true. They became progressively less effective as arguments around the end of the second week. The specific moment of failure, she could identify it precisely, as she could identify most things precisely, was an evening in late October when a storm came down from the north and buried the ranch in 2 feet of snow overnight. In the morning the world was white and still, and the temperature had dropped 30 degrees, and they could not ride out, and the cattle had to be checked and fed, which involved 2 hours in the barn in the cold. And Calvin came in for breakfast at 9 with snow in his hair and ice on his coat, and he stood near the fire to warm his hands, and she was at the table with her rebuilt cipher work spread out in front of her, and he looked at her work and said, quietly, "Show me how it works." Not as condescension, not as the particular brand of patronizing interest that men sometimes showed in women's work, the kind that says I am being gracious by paying attention to your little project. His voice carried the same genuine curiosity he brought to the Lewis and Clark book, the same quality of wanting to understand something for its own sake. She showed him. She started with the basic principles of substitution cipher, how each letter maps to another letter through a defined key, how the key can be structured as a simple alphabet shift or as a more complex grid of transpositions. She explained how her system worked. A 26 by 26 letter grid organized by a keyword, so that the cipher changed entirely with each new keyword and could not be broken by frequency analysis alone. She walked him through the decipherment of the original message that had started everything, showing him step by step how the encoded nonsense resolved into meaning. He sat across the table from her and followed every step. He asked questions that were not elementary questions that showed he was already thinking about the structure of the system, not just its application. When she showed him the frequency analysis weakness of simple substitution ciphers, he asked whether the 26 by 26 grid could be made deeper by using numbers in addition to letters, and she stopped and looked at him and said, "Yes, exactly. That is precisely the next level of complexity, and the reason I use a hybrid system for the most sensitive communications." He had the grace not to look smug about this. He simply nodded, as if having arrived at the right question was its own sufficient satisfaction. They spent 3 hours at the cipher that morning, and outside the snow fell and fell, and the fire in the hearth burned low, and she rebuilt it once without thinking about it. And somewhere in the second hour they had both shifted in their chairs, so that they were sitting slightly closer to the notebook between them. And at some point, his shoulder was near hers, and neither of them moved away. When she finally looked up from the cipher work and found him looking at her, not at the notebook, at her, she felt the particular quality of the moment with complete clarity and did not look away. "What?" she said, directly, because that was how she spoke. "I was thinking," he said, "that I have been very stupid for the past 2 weeks." She waited. "I have been telling myself that what I was feeling was gratitude," he said, "for what you did, riding out here, the whole of it. I told myself that was all it was." "And is it?" "No," he said, simply the way he said everything that mattered. She was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts with the swift efficiency that was her nature, and in those few seconds she made the choice, not impulsively but clearly, with full knowledge of what she was choosing and what it cost and why it was worth it anyway. "I have been telling myself that I am temporary," she said, "that the station will be rebuilt and I will move back to town, and this will have been a professional interlude." "And is it?" She met his eyes. "No," she said, "it is not." He reached across the cipher notebook. All those rows and columns of carefully constructed code, all those secrets made plain, and his hand covered hers on the table, and the warmth of it was immediate and right in the way that things are when they have been true for longer than you have been willing to admit them. He did not kiss her then. She thought, with the part of her that was always observing, that this was the right instinct. that the moment needed to be held for a beat before it moved, that rushing it would diminish it. He simply sat with his hand over hers and looked at her, and she looked back, and the snow fell outside and the fire crackled, and the Cipher notebook lay open between them like a solved problem. The next day the snow was still down, but the sky had cleared to a hard, bright blue, and they rode out together to check the cattle on the North Range. A long, cold ride through a landscape that looked sculpted rather than natural, every contour smoothed and simplified by the overnight snowfall, the Powder River just visible in the distance as a dark thread through white country. They talked as they rode, and the conversation had the ease of two people who have said a true thing and no longer need to manage the space between them. He told her about the North Range, about the way the land held moisture differently from the South pasture, about a particular ridgeline where in summer the grass grew so thick and tall it came up to a horse's belly. She told him about her plans for the rebuilt Cipher system. She had been thinking about the hybrid number-letter grid he had suggested, and she had worked out a theoretical framework for it that she wanted to test. "You thought about my question," he said, with a quality in his voice that she was learning to recognize as pleasure. "I think about everything people say to me," she said, "but I thought about yours more than most." He reached across the space between their horses and took her gloved hand briefly, and she let him hold it for a moment before the terrain required her to have both hands on the reins. The weeks that followed were the happiest, she would later say, not unhappily, but honestly, that she had spent since childhood. There was the work. The rebuilt station went up in early November, new equipment arrived from Cheyenne, and she was back at her key by the 15th with a rebuilt Cipher system that incorporated the hybrid grid and was demonstrably more secure than anything she had used before. Western Union was pleased. The regional director wrote personally to commend her handling of the entire situation, and there was a quiet acknowledgement in his letter that her analysis and documentation had been instrumental in a fraud case that would set important legal precedents for land deed security in the territory. And there was Calvin. She rode out to the ranch 3 evenings a week, or he rode into town on those days when business brought him near enough to stop. They ate supper together at the hotel dining room, which caused a certain amount of interested observation from the citizens of Rattlesnake Creek, none of which particularly troubled either of them. Mrs. Hutchins, who Mabel had come to like enormously for her broad practicality and her complete disinterest in any opinion she had not actively solicited, expressed her approval in the form of sending an apple pie to the telegraph station one morning with a note that said simply, "About time." By December, the legal proceedings against Voss and Whitmore had advanced to the point where both men faced federal charges. Voss for conspiracy to commit land fraud, and as an accessory to arson, Whitmore for forgery and fraud. The clerk from Whitmore's office who had sent the original warning, a young man named Thomas Herrick, 24 years old and considerably braver than most people in his situation would have been, had come forward as a witness for the prosecution, and his testimony, combined with Mabel's decoded documentation and Calvin's original deed, made the case against them both effectively unassailable. Harlan Voss's cattle operation in Buffalo passed to his business partners. The land he had been trying to steal remained Calvin Dalton's. On a cold evening in the second week of December, Calvin rode into Rattlesnake Creek with something about him that was slightly different from the ordinary. He came to the telegraph station after dark, which was unusual. He was a man of regular rhythms, and he knocked on the newly rebuilt door with the particular knock she had come to recognize, and she opened it, and he came in out of the cold, bringing the smell of cold air and horse and the night. He stood in the middle of her rebuilt station, new equipment on the bench, new Cipher notebooks lined on the new shelf, everything clean and functional in hers, and he looked at her with the expression that she had learned contained more than he always knew how to say out loud. "I need to ask you something," he said. Then ask, she said. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands in the one gesture she had identified as his tell for genuine nervousness, and she found it so unexpectedly endearing in a man of such controlled self-possession that she felt something warm move through her entire chest. "I want you to stay," he said, "in Rattlesnake Creek. Not in the station. I mean, yes, in the station too, if that's what you want, but I mean that I want to marry you, Mabel, if you'll have me. I want you to be at the ranch. I want the Cipher notebooks on the shelf and the lamp on late and you. I want you there." She stood for a moment with the Morse key under her right hand and the soft light of the station lamp filling the room, and she looked at this man who had gone from a name in a wire ledger to the most significant person in her world in the space of 6 extraordinary weeks, and she made the calculation with the part of her mind that always told the truth. "Yes," she said. Simply, the way he had taught her to mean it when simplicity was all that was needed. He crossed the room in 2 steps and kissed her, and it was as unhurried and definite as everything else about him. And she kissed him back with everything she had, which was, as anyone who knew her would attest, considerable. They were married in March of 1883, in the small church at Rattlesnake Creek, in a ceremony that was brief and honest and attended by a room full of people who seemed, in the way that small frontier towns could surprise you with their warmth, genuinely glad. Mrs. Hutchins wore her best dress and wept, which she did not try to conceal. Deputy Ford, promoted to full marshal over the winter, stood in the back and looked proud in the way of young men at other people's happily resolving dramas. Thomas Herrick, the brave young clerk who had sent the warning that had started everything, had ridden up from Cheyenne to serve as a witness, and Mabel shook his hand before the ceremony with the direct warmth of someone paying a genuine debt. The wedding ring was a simple gold band that Calvin had ordered from Denver, plain, well made, built to last. She wore it with the same uncomplicated satisfaction she brought to all things that were real. She kept her position with Western Union. This had been, in the negotiations that were never actually called negotiations, because both of them were too practical for that, simply obvious. She was the Rattlesnake Creek telegraph operator, and she was also Calvin Dalton's wife, and the 2 facts were not in competition. She rode the 22 miles between the station and the ranch on alternate days, staying in town on the busier wire days and at the ranch on the quieter ones. And on the days she was in town, Calvin sometimes rode in at evening. And on the days she was at the ranch, she worked on her Cipher system at the big kitchen table while he read his books by the fire. And the life they made was the kind of life that fits because it was built to actual measurements. In the summer of 1883, Mabel wrote a formal paper on cipher theory for the Western Union Technical Journal, a rigorous, thorough document that laid out the mathematical principles behind her hybrid substitution system, and proposed it as a standard for high-security commercial wire communications. The paper was read by the company's chief technical officer in New York, who wrote back expressing admiration and a strong interest in piloting the system on the transcontinental line. She showed the letter to Calvin at supper. He read it twice carefully, and then set it down and looked at her with the expression she had come to know best of all, the one that was not quite the not quite smile anymore, but something fully realized, something warm and specific and meant entirely for her. "You are astonishing," he said. "I know," she said pleasantly, because humility had never been her strongest quality, and he loved her better for it. "I mean it," he said. "I know that too," she said, and reached across the table and took his hand. And they sat together in the lamplight of the ranch house where she had arrived covered in smoke on a midnight ride 6 months ago. And outside the summer was high and gold on the Wyoming grassland, and the Powder River ran bright in the distance. Their first child was born in the spring of 1884, a boy, which caused Calvin Dalton an almost comic degree of emotion that he managed to contain to a single moment of sitting very still with his face in his hands, while Mabel watched him from the bed with the clear-eyed affection of someone who was, despite never having expected to want this particular life, entirely glad to have it. They named him James after Calvin's father because it was a name that meant, "We remember where we came from." James was a serious, observant baby who watched the world with dark eyes that were very like his father's, and who was, from very early, fascinated by the telegraph key at the Rattlesnake Creek station, reaching for it with both hands whenever Mabel brought him in, drawn by the clicking sound it made like a small animal toward a bright, interesting thing. "He's going to be a telegraph operator," Mabel said one afternoon, watching this. "God help the people who have to receive his transmissions," Calvin said, and she laughed a full, real laugh, and the sound of it filled the rebuilt station and went out through the open door into the Rattlesnake Creek afternoon. The autumn of 1884 brought the conclusion of the Voss and Whitmore trial, which had worked its way through the territorial court system with the slow thoroughness of frontier justice. Both men were convicted, Voss on conspiracy and accessory to arson charges, Whitmore on forgery and fraud. The sentences were substantial. Harlan Voss would not be a problem for a very long time. On the day the verdict was announced, Mabel received a wire from Cheyenne sent from the territorial marshal's office, formal and official, confirming the outcome and acknowledging, with more warmth than official communications usually contained, the instrumental role of the operator at Rattlesnake Creek in building the evidentiary case. She read it at her key, filed it in the station log, and then wrote 3 words on a separate slip of paper and put it in her coat pocket to show Calvin when she rode out that evening. The 3 words were, "Justice was served." He read them at the kitchen table and looked up at her. "Yes," he said, "it was, and then, thanks to you." "Thanks to both of us," she said, which was more accurate. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was long and cold, as Wyoming winters tended to be, but it was also the winter during which Mabel completed her Cipher manual, a full technical document covering every aspect of the system she had developed, cross-referenced with the mathematical theory behind it, written with the precision and clarity of someone who cared about her readers' ability to actually use what she was teaching them. She dedicated it to her father, the printer who had given her words as a physical thing, and to the unnamed clerk in Whitmore's office who had taken a risk to tell the truth, and to one other person whose name she wrote last, and with the kind of feeling that plain writing sometimes carries better than elaborate sentiment, C.J.D., who listened. The manual was published by the Western Union Technical Press in 1886, making Mabel Winslow Dalton the first woman to publish a formal technical manual in the company's history. The regional director, who had written to commend her in 1882, sent a congratulatory wire that was considerably warmer than official communications usually were. Mrs. Hutchins bought 3 copies from the Cheyenne bookseller who stocked them and displayed them prominently in the general store, which caused Mabel a degree of embarrassed warmth that she managed to conceal almost completely. Their second child, a daughter this time, arrived in the summer of 1886. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, because the name suited her from the moment she arrived. A bright, vivid girl with her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn certainty about things. She was, from very early, a person with strong opinions. James, age 2, received his sister with the grave solemnity of a serious child encountering an unexpected complication in the established order, and then, after approximately 4 days of careful observation, declared her acceptable and proceeded to be, for the rest of his life, her steadfast defender and occasional opponent. The ranch continued to prosper. Calvin expanded the herd carefully, in the deliberate way that built something permanent rather than something fast. He added a second barn, improved the water management on the North Range, and began working with 2 neighboring ranchers on a cooperative agreement for the winter grazing that benefited all 3 operations. His reputation in the territory was one of absolute reliability, a man who said what he meant, and meant what he said, whose handshake was as good as a signed contract. Mabel continued her work at the station through 1887, by which time her system had been piloted successfully on 3 segments of the transcontinental telegraph line, and the results were sufficiently promising that Western Union's New York office was in formal discussions about a broader rollout. She was asked, in a careful and somewhat tentative letter from the company, whether she would be willing to travel to New York to consult on the implementation. She and Calvin discussed it at length one evening, with the fireplace going and the children in bed and the winter wind working at the windows the way Wyoming wind always did persistently, testing every joint. "It would be 2 months," she said, "3 at most. I know. The station can run on locum cover for that period. There is a man in Sheridan who is qualified. I have worked with him. I know. You're going to tell me to go," she said, reading his expression. "You're going to tell yourself to go," he said, "because you already know it's the right decision. I'm just telling you that I agree with you." She looked at him. He met her eyes with the same steady directness that had been the first thing she trusted about him. "I will miss you aggressively," she said. "I'll be here when you get back," he said. She went to New York in the spring of 1888 and spent 11 weeks consulting with Western Union's technical division on the Cipher system implementation. And it was, professionally, the most significant period of her career, a concentrated, intense immersion in the company's highest technical operations, working with engineers and mathematicians who treated her with the unambiguous respect of people encountering genuine expertise they needed. She was, unmistakably and undeniably, the most knowledgeable person in those rooms on the specific question of field-deployed Cipher security, and the rooms were full of people who knew it. She missed Calvin with the focused, specific ache of someone who had not fully understood what home meant until she was a great distance from it. She wrote to him every 3 days longer letters than she had expected to write, more personal, less guarded. The letters of someone who had stopped performing steadiness and was simply being herself because he was the one person she had never needed to perform for. He wrote back in the terse but warm style that was his, letters that said less than they meant and somehow meant more for it. She was home in June, on a Thursday afternoon, arriving at the Rattlesnake Creek depot on the Cheyenne train, and Calvin was there on the platform with James, who was 4 now and grave and excited in equal measure, and Clara on his arm, who was almost 2 and entirely undisguised in her preferences, reaching for her mother with both arms from 6 feet away. Mabel took her daughter and held her with the uncalculated intensity of someone who had been missing this exact weight and warmth for 11 weeks. Over Clara's dark curls she looked at Calvin, who was looking at her with the expression that was his and only his, not the not-quite smile anymore, not the careful blankness, but the fully open thing that he had arrived at somewhere around the 2nd week of October 1882, riding through the dark Wyoming prairie beside a woman covered in smoke and ash who had shown up to save him. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said, and kissed her on the platform in front of the whole of Rattlesnake Creek, which was either scandal or ceremony depending on who was watching. Mrs. Hutchins, who had come to meet the train on no particular errand, watched with satisfaction and said to no one in particular, "About time." Still, life resumed. The Cipher system was formally adopted on the major transcontinental line segments in 1889, and the documentation in the Western Union technical record cited the Winslow-Dalton system by name, which gave Mabel a satisfaction so pure it was almost physical. The Wyoming Territory became Wyoming State in July of 1890, an occasion Calvin marked by buying a good bottle of whiskey and Mabel marked by updating all her maps, and they sat on the porch in the summer evening and talked about the country they were part of and what it was becoming and what they hoped for it. And the conversation went very late, and the whiskey was excellent. A 3rd child came in 1891, a 2nd son they named Robert, who had his grandmother's coloring fair, light-eyed, entirely different from his dark siblings, as if the family were collecting variety. He was a loud, cheerful baby who never, from his very first days, seemed to doubt that the world was a place worth making noise in. James, 7, received his new brother with considerably more enthusiasm than he had received Clara 5 years earlier, because he had learned from Clara that younger siblings could be interesting. The years accumulated the way years do in a life that is truly and sustainably lived, not in dramatic peaks, but in the rich, textured ordinary that forms the substance of everything real. There were difficult seasons. The drought year of 1893 that tested every rancher in Wyoming and required Calvin to make hard decisions about the herd with the calm, clear-eyed pragmatism he brought to all crises. There was a winter illness that swept through the ranch house in 1895, keeping all 3 children in bed for 10 days while Mabel and Calvin, operating on fractured sleep and strong coffee and sheer determination, nursed them through it. There were good years and tight years and extraordinary years, and through all of them the Cipher notebooks accumulated on the shelf above the Morse key, and the lamp burned late on the evenings when she was working, and the fire burned in the ranch house hearth, and the bay gelding and the gray mare. Eventually, their descendants were kept in the well-built barn beside the Powder River. Thomas Herrick, the brave young clerk who had started everything by sending that encoded warning, came to visit in 1894, now a lawyer himself, practicing in Laramie. He had built a good career on the reputation for integrity that his testimony in the Voss Whitmore trial had established. He stayed for 3 days and left with an open invitation to return, and on his last evening they sat on the ranch house porch in the summer dark and talked about that October night in 1882, the way you can talk about something once enough time has passed to see its whole shape. "I wasn't sure anyone would break the cipher," Thomas said. "I wasn't sure anyone at the Rattlesnake Creek station had the capability." "I had been there 2 weeks," Mabel said. "I had barely introduced myself to anyone." "But you broke it in 11 minutes, Thomas said. "It was a fairly simple system," she said. Calvin, from his chair beside her, made a sound. "She says that about everything she's better at than everyone else," he said. "It's a habit." "It's accurate," she said. "It's both," he said. The look they exchanged across the porch in the dark was the kind that belongs entirely to 2 people who have built something together over years and know the exact weight and value of every part of it. In the late summer of 1896, Mabel was contacted by the newly established Wyoming State University in Laramie, which was developing its first curriculum in applied mathematics and scientific communication. Would she be willing to consider a part-time lectureship in cipher theory and telegraph communications? The position would require her presence in Laramie 4 weeks per year, arranged around her Western Union schedule. She discussed it with Calvin over several evenings, in the way they discussed everything thoroughly, honestly, without performing positions they did not hold. "It means more time away," she said. "James is 12, Calvin said. "He can take on more at the ranch. Clara is 10 and she already manages half the horses. Robert is 5 and he has opinions about everything." "We are not a fragile household. You're telling me to go again," she said. "I'm telling you that the University of Wyoming is trying to teach cipher theory to Wyoming mathematicians, and there is exactly one person in the state who could do that properly," he said. "I'm also telling you that I would like our children to grow up knowing that their mother's knowledge has a formal institutional home because it deserves one." Mabel was quiet for a moment. "That is," she said carefully, "possibly the most meaningful thing anyone has ever said to me about my work." "Good," he said. "Then you should go do it." She accepted the lectureship. Her first lecture at Wyoming State University in October of 1896 was attended by 32 students, 2 faculty members, the university president, and sitting in the back row with the slightly too still quality of a man trying very hard not to look proud, Calvin Dalton, who had ridden up from Rattlesnake Creek on the pretense of a supply purchase and had somehow ended up in a university lecture hall. She saw him when she walked in, and she paused for approximately 1 second, and the corner of her mouth moved in the way it did when she was containing something. Then she turned to the board and began to write, in her clean, precise hand, the first row of her cipher grid, and 32 students and 2 faculty members leaned forward in their seats, and the thing she had built in her mind over 20 years of solitary, passionate, unstoppable work began to enter the world in the most permanent way, not through a wire, not through a published manual, but through the open, curious minds of people who would carry it forward. Afterward, in the hall outside the lecture room, Calvin found her surrounded by students with questions, and he waited with his hat in his hands and his characteristic patience until the last student had drifted away, and then she turned to him. "You are a very poor liar," she said. "I've never claimed to be a good one," he said. "Why are you here?" "I wanted to hear you teach," he said, simply. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had met her at a midnight door with a rifle and bare feet, who had listened and acted and stood to one side when the work was hers to do and stepped forward when the work was his, who had offered his spare room out of practical generosity, and had ended up with her cipher notebooks on his shelf and her lamp burning late in his house, and 14 years of the most vivid, honest, demanding, and sustaining love she had ever imagined having. "Well," she said, "what did you think?" "I think," he said, in the voice that dropped slightly when he meant something with particular depth, "that you were right about everything from the beginning." "I usually am," she said. "You usually are," he agreed. They walked out into the Laramie afternoon together, into the sharp, bright October air that smelled of coming winter and wide-open country, and she took his arm in the way she had learned to take it, without hesitation, without self-consciousness, with the full confidence of a woman who had arrived at this man by the most direct route available to her. 22 miles in the dark, the cipher in her head, and the absolute refusal to let an injustice stand. The gray mare's granddaughter was stabled at the livery down the street. The Powder River was 2 days' ride to the north, running bright and cold through the country that was theirs. The story of the cipher woman and the rancher had started with smoke and midnight, and a burning building and a desperate ride. It had moved through fraud and fire, and the particular heroism of a woman who kept everything that mattered in her head and rode toward the crisis rather than away from it. It had found, in the unexpected encounter between 2 solitary, capable, and genuinely extraordinary people, the thing that both had built their independence to protect themselves from needing, something real and someone equal to them. The telegraph station at Rattlesnake Creek stood for 20 more years, rebuilt and expanded twice as the territory's communications needs grew, its cipher protocols the most secure in the region. Mabel Winslow Dalton worked the key there until 1908, when she retired with Western Union's highest operational commendation and a formal citation from the Wyoming State Historical Record for her contribution to the development of field cipher security in the American West. James Dalton became a lawyer, eventually practicing in Cheyenne, and his ability to hold complex systems of evidence in his head, to see the hidden structure in a mass of documents, was a quality that made his colleagues marvel and that anyone who knew his mother would recognize immediately. Clara Dalton married a rancher from the Sheridan country, a man of quiet strength and real humor who looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had found precisely what they were looking for, and she received him with the directness and warmth and absolute confidence that were her inheritance from both her parents. Robert Dalton, the loud and cheerful one, became a telegraph engineer, which surprised no one who had watched him at age 4 attempting to tap messages on the kitchen table with a spoon and insisting they were real words. Calvin Dalton worked the ranch on the Powder River until he was in his late 60s, by which point his children and the children of his neighboring ranchers had taken on the daily labor, and he spent his mornings in the saddle on the North Range he loved, and his evenings at the kitchen table where the cipher notebooks still lived on the shelf, and where the lamp still burned late when his wife was working. On a warm evening in the spring of 1915, More than 30 years after a midnight fire and a 22-mile ride had brought them together. They sat on the porch of the ranch house above the Powder River and watched the last of the sunset drain out of the sky to the west, and the first stars appear above the Wyoming highland, and the river catch the last light and hold it for a moment before letting it go. She had her cipher notebook on her knee because she always had her cipher notebook somewhere near, and he had his book because he always had a book within reach, and they were quiet in the way of two people who have nothing they need to hide from each other and no silence between them that is not companionable. "I have been thinking," she said after a while, "about that first night." "Which part?" he asked. "The porch," she said. "You came out with your rifle and no shoes." "I moved fast," he said. "You were barefoot on cold boards," she said, "and you listened to everything I said. You made a very organized case," he said. "I was covered in smoke and ash, and I had been awake for 20 hours. "You were," he agreed, "the most impressive person I had ever seen in my life." She looked at him, and he looked back at her with the expression that had never changed in 30 years, not the careful blankness, not the not-quite smile, but the fully open, entirely unguarded thing that he had arrived at somewhere between the cipher notebook on the table and the first cold dawn they rode toward together. "I knew," he said, "somewhere around the second hour of that ride that I was in a great deal of trouble." "So did I," she said. "I was considerably less pleased about it at the time. And now—" She looked at the stars coming up over Wyoming, at the river in the valley below the ridge, at the lights in the barn where the horses were settled for the night, at the house behind them where their life had accumulated in layers of meaning and labor and love. She looked at this man who had listened, and acted, and stood exactly where she needed him to stand, and stepped back when she needed him to step back, and never once in 32 years suggested that she be anything other than exactly what she was. "Now," she said, "I am very pleased." The stars blazed on over Wyoming, as they always had, indifferent in their magnificence, like the country itself. The cipher notebooks would outlast them both, cataloged eventually in the Wyoming State Historical Society's collection with a plaque that read, "The Winslow-Dalton Cipher System, developed by Mabel Winslow Dalton, telegraph operator and cryptographer, 1880–1908. The foundational document of Western field cryptography." The Dalton Ranch on the Powder River would stand for another generation after them, passed to James, and then to James's son, the land that Harlan Voss had tried to steal still carrying the name of the man who had kept it. But that was afterward. What was now was the porch, and the warm spring evening, and the sound of the Powder River below the ridge, and two people who had found each other on a night of fire and urgency, and had spent 30 years discovering what the finding meant. Mabel Winslow Dalton put her cipher notebook aside and leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, and Calvin Dalton put his arm around her and his book in his lap, and they sat together as the last light died, and the stars took full possession of the Wyoming sky, and the night was still and wide and entirely, perfectly at peace. The telegraph burned down at midnight, and the cipher woman rode to warn the rancher, and everything that followed was the consequence of that one true, brave, indispensable act of a woman who kept the important things in her head and rode toward the danger rather than away from it, and of a man who opened the door and listened, and was never, for the rest of his remarkable life, the same.